The Cascadia region spans nearly 1.4 million square kilometers and houses over 17 million people in what many consider the most livable place on Earth. Rain-soaked forests, volcanic peaks, and thriving cities from Vancouver to Portland create a bioregional paradise. But scientists have discovered something terrifying beneath this natural wonderland. A 600-mile fault line so overdue that when it finally ruptures, the devastation will be felt on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. What draws millions of people to live in a region where the ground could literally give way beneath their feet at any moment? What makes Cascadia special? To understand this attraction, you need to grasp what makes Cascadia fundamentally different from anywhere else on Earth. Cascadia operates as a bioregion, a place defined by natural characteristics like watersheds and ecosystems, rather than political boundaries drawn by governments. This vast territory stretches from Alaska's Copper River to California's Cape Mendocino, with the Pacific Ocean forming its western edge and the interior mountains of Wyoming, Montana, British Columbia, and Yukon marking its eastern boundaries. The region's identity stems from shared environmental characteristics that create a coherent ecological zone operating according to its own natural rhythms. With some of the world's densest temperate rainforests and iconic volcanoes, Cascadia's varied ecosystems draw millions of people who find themselves captivated by landscapes that shift dramatically from coastal wilderness to volcanic peaks to fertile valleys within the span of a few hundred miles. The temperate rainforests represent some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth, supporting ancient trees that can live for over 1,000 years. These forests create cathedral-like environments where filtered sunlight supports understory growth that feels almost prehistoric. The volcanic peaks that define Cascadia's skyline include Mount Rainier at 14,411 feet, Mount Hood at 11,249 feet, and Mount Shasta at 14,179 feet. These snow-capped giants serve as landmarks visible from vast distances, drawing millions of visitors who see only beauty where scientists recognize geological warning signs. Cascadia's climate patterns create perfect conditions for this green paradise. The region sits where Pacific Ocean currents moderate temperatures year-round, while warm, moist air from the Pacific creates the consistent rainfall that keeps the region perpetually green. This consistent moisture creates growing conditions so favorable that introduced species often grow larger and more vigorously than in their native habitats. The abundant wildlife adds another layer of attraction. Orcas patrol the waters while salmon runs still fill many rivers despite development pressure. Black bears, mountain goats, and Roosevelt elk inhabit the forests, while bald eagles nest along the coastline. The region's position along the Pacific Flyway makes it a crucial stopover for millions of migratory birds, creating world-class wildlife viewing opportunities. Indigenous communities have maintained their connection to this landscape for thousands of years, developing sophisticated cultures that worked in harmony with the region's natural cycles. Their oral histories contain detailed accounts of major geological events, including the Great Earthquake of 1700, preserving knowledge that modern science has only recently begun to understand and appreciate. These accounts provide crucial evidence of the region's seismic past and help scientists understand the patterns of destruction that have repeatedly reshaped Cascadia. The coastline presents an almost endless variety of experiences, from rugged sea stacks to wide sandy beaches to fjord-like inlets. Tidal pools teem with marine life, while offshore waters support some of the richest fishing grounds in the Pacific. The contrast between dense forest and open ocean creates dramatic scenery that changes with the light and weather, offering new perspectives throughout the year. This natural beauty sits atop one of the most geologically active regions on Earth. The Pacific Ring of Fire earned its name from the volcanic and seismic activity that circles the Pacific Ocean, and Cascadia occupies a particularly volatile section of this ring. The same tectonic forces that created the region's stunning mountain ranges and fertile valleys also created the Cascadia Subduction Zone, the 600-mile-long fault line that runs beneath the ocean floor from Vancouver Island to Northern California. The geological positioning that makes Cascadia so naturally beautiful also makes it exceptionally dangerous. The Juan de Fuca plate continuously pushes beneath the North American plate, creating the pressure that builds the region's mountains while simultaneously building toward a catastrophic release of energy. This subduction process occurs so slowly that human lifespans cannot perceive the gradual accumulation of stress. But geological time operates on different scales than human time. The region's location along the Pacific Ring of Fire creates a fundamental paradox. The same tectonic activity that generates the volcanic peaks, fertile soils, and dramatic topography that make Cascadia so attractive also guarantees that major earthquakes will periodically reshape the landscape. The beauty that draws millions of residents and visitors results directly from geological processes that will eventually unleash devastating destruction across the entire region. The volcanic activity that created Mount Rainier, Mount Hood, and Mount Shasta continues today, with several peaks showing signs of potential future eruptions. However, the volcanic threat pales in comparison to the seismic threat posed by the Cascadia subduction zone. While volcanic eruptions typically affect relatively small areas, a major earthquake along the subduction zone would impact the entire bioregion simultaneously, affecting every major population center from Vancouver to Northern California. Despite growing scientific understanding of these geological risks, development continues at an unprecedented pace throughout Cascadia. The region's natural advantages have created economic opportunities that seem to outweigh the long-term risks, leading to population growth that places more people in harm's way with each passing year. The same forces that created this natural paradise have also created something else entirely unexpected in what many consider a remote corner of North America. The economic powerhouse hidden in plain sight. Cascadia's economic output reached $1.5 trillion in 2025, making it one of the most productive regions on the planet. This figure represents a staggering concentration of wealth packed into a relatively small geographic area, and it's growing faster than most economists predicted just 5 years ago. Seattle alone contributes roughly $400 billion to this total, driven primarily by its transformation into a global technology center. Amazon's headquarters sprawls across multiple city blocks, employing over 75,000 people in the metro area. Microsoft's Redmond campus houses another 50,000 workers who develop software used by billions worldwide. These tech giants anchor an ecosystem of innovation that extends throughout the region, creating a concentration of technological expertise that rivals Silicon Valley. Vancouver contributes approximately $300 billion annually, functioning as Canada's gateway to the Pacific. The city's port handles over 140 million tons of cargo yearly, making it North America's largest port by tonnage. Film and television production adds another $3 billion annually, with Vancouver serving as a stand-in for cities worldwide due to its diverse architecture and favorable exchange rates. The region's cannabis industry, legalized in Canada in 2018, now generates over $2 billion in economic activity across British Columbia. Portland rounds out the major metropolitan contributions with roughly $200 billion in annual economic output. The city has become a hub for sustainable manufacturing, with companies like Nike maintaining global headquarters here. Intel operates multiple fabrication facilities in the Portland metro area, producing computer chips that power everything from smartphones to data centers. The region's craft brewing industry, while smaller in absolute terms, has achieved global recognition and drives significant tourism revenue. Forestry and agriculture contribute tens of billions annually to Cascadia's economy through sustainable practices that balance resource extraction with environmental stewardship. Modern logging operations use selective harvesting techniques that maintain forest health while producing lumber for construction markets across North America and Asia. British Columbia's forestry sector targets Asian markets where demand for North American lumber continues growing, while agricultural operations from British Columbia's Okanagan Valley wine industry to Washington State's apple orchards supply products across the Pacific Rim. Tourism brings in approximately $75 billion annually as visitors flock to experience Cascadia's natural wonders. Olympic National Park alone attracts over 3 million visitors yearly, contributing $300 million to the regional economy. Yellowstone's northern reaches, technically part of Greater Cascadia, add another $500 million in tourism revenue. Vancouver's cruise ship industry processes over 1 million passengers annually, with most heading to Alaska's Inside Passage. Portland's food scene draws culinary tourists from around the world, while Seattle's music venues and cultural attractions maintain the city's reputation as a creative hub. The shipping and trade infrastructure that connects Cascadia to global markets represents one of its most valuable economic assets. The Port of Seattle handles container traffic worth over $70 billion annually, while the Port of Vancouver processes goods valued at $200 billion yearly. These facilities serve as crucial links between North American producers and Asian consumers, handling everything from agricultural products to manufactured goods. The region's airports facilitate another $30 billion in trade, with Seattle-Tacoma International serving as a major cargo hub for companies like FedEx and UPS. Cascadia's combined economic output would rank it as the world's 8th largest economy if it were an independent nation, larger than Italy or Brazil. This concentration of wealth stems from the region's unique advantages, including abundant natural resources, skilled workforce, and strategic location on the Pacific Rim. The area's universities produce thousands of engineering and science graduates annually, feeding talent into local industries. Venture capital firms have invested over $15 billion in Cascadian startups since 2020, creating new companies that further diversify the regional economy. Energy production adds another dimension to Cascadia's economic strength. Hydroelectric dams along the Columbia River system generate over 20,000 megawatts of clean electricity, much of it exported to California and other western states. Wind farms in eastern Oregon and Washington produce additional renewable energy, while British Columbia's extensive hydroelectric system powers both domestic consumption and exports. This clean energy advantage attracts manufacturing companies seeking to reduce their carbon footprint while maintaining competitive production costs. The region's financial services sector, while smaller than traditional banking centers, specializes in sustainable investing and technology financing. Several major banks have established operations here to serve the growing tech industry, while credit unions focus on community development and environmental projects. Real estate values have surged across the region, with median home prices exceeding $500,000 in most urban areas, creating substantial wealth effects that ripple through local economies. But here's the troubling reality lurking beneath these impressive economic statistics. All of this wealth sits directly above one of the most dangerous geological features on Earth. The same tectonic forces that created Cascadia's stunning landscape and abundant resources also pose an existential threat to the entire economic ecosystem. When disaster strikes, and scientists agree it will, this concentrated wealth becomes a massive liability. The region's prosperity has drawn millions of people and trillions of dollars in infrastructure to precisely the area most vulnerable to catastrophic seismic events. The irony is inescapable. Cascadia's location along the Pacific Ring of Fire, which provides the geological conditions for its natural beauty and resource abundance, also ensures that its economic success story sits on borrowed time. Every new skyscraper, every expanded port facility, every tech campus represents both economic progress and increased vulnerability. The question isn't whether this economic powerhouse will face its geological reckoning, but what happens to $1.5 trillion in annual economic output when the earth beneath it decides to move? And that calculation becomes even more sobering when you consider exactly how many people now call this geologically unstable region home. 18 million people living on borrowed time. Right now, over 17 million people live their daily lives across Cascadia, and most of them have no idea they're sitting on top of one of the most dangerous geological features on the planet. These aren't just abstract numbers on a census report. These are families in suburban neighborhoods, workers in downtown offices, students in universities, and retirees in coastal communities who wake up each morning without giving a second thought to the massive tectonic forces building pressure directly beneath their feet. The Vancouver-Portland corridor houses over 80% of the region's 17 million residents, despite representing only 17% of Cascadia's total land mass. This concentration creates what urban planners call the Cascadia megaregion, a nearly continuous stretch of cities and suburbs that houses roughly 13.6 million people in an area smaller than many individual states. Vancouver alone is home to 2.6 million residents in its metropolitan area, while Seattle houses 4.2 million people across King, Pierce, and Snohomish counties. Portland's metro area contains another 2.5 million residents, and the spaces between these major centers have filled with smaller cities like Olympia, Tacoma, and Salem that collectively house millions more. The population boom over the past decade has been nothing short of remarkable. Between 2010 and 2025, the US portion of Cascadia grew from 8.4 million to 8.7 million people, with projections showing this trend accelerating toward 12 million by 2050. British Columbia added 900,000 residents during the same period, with most settling in the Vancouver area. The Cascadia Innovation Corridor alone is projected to reach 5.8 million residents by 2050, representing one of the fastest-growing economic regions in North America. Commuters now spend 11 days a year in traffic, an 18% increase in a decade. Several factors drive this population surge. Technology companies continue expanding their operations here, creating high-paying jobs that attract skilled workers from across the continent. The region's reputation for environmental consciousness draws people seeking sustainable lifestyles, while its moderate climate appeals to those fleeing extreme weather elsewhere. Housing costs, while high, remain lower than equivalent cities like San Francisco or New York. The outdoor recreation opportunities, from skiing to hiking to sailing, create a quality of life that recruiting managers use to lure top talent. But consider the vulnerability of these urban centers. Historic centers and major transport hubs, downtown Seattle, Vancouver's waterfront, Portland's bridges, sit on soft soils or filling, making them seismic liabilities. Seattle's downtown core rises on filled wetlands and loose sediments that will amplify seismic waves during a major earthquake. The city's iconic Space Needle, built for the 1962 World's Fair, underwent seismic retrofitting in 2018, but thousands of older buildings lack similar protection. The South Lake Union area, where Amazon's headquarters employs 75,000 people, sits on soil that could liquefy during strong shaking. Pioneer Square, the city's historic heart, contains unreinforced masonry buildings that structural engineers consider death traps in a major earthquake. Vancouver's waterfront presents a different but equally troubling vulnerability. The city's downtown peninsula, where 200,000 people work daily, sits at near sea level with False Creek and English Bay on either side. The region's newest skyscrapers meet modern seismic standards, but the older residential towers that house much of the city's population were built before current earthquake codes. Richmond, home to 200,000 people and Vancouver's international airport, sits on a river delta that could experience severe liquefaction. The city's port facilities, crucial to Canada's Pacific trade, occupy reclaimed land that may not withstand major ground shaking. Portland's infrastructure presents unique challenges with its network of bridges spanning the Willamette River. The city depends on these crossings for basic transportation, but most were built decades before modern seismic standards. The Burnside Bridge, completed in 1926, carries 40,000 vehicles daily and is considered highly vulnerable to earthquake damage. The Ross Island Bridge, built in 1926, and the Hawthorne Bridge, dating to 1910, would likely fail in a major earthquake, potentially trapping residents on either side of the river. The city's eastern neighborhoods, home to 400,000 people, could find themselves cut off from emergency services located west of the river. Smaller coastal communities face the most immediate danger from tsunamis. Cannon Beach, Oregon, with 1,700 permanent residents, sits barely above sea level and hosts thousands of tourists who wouldn't know evacuation routes. Westport, Washington, houses 2,100 people in an area that tsunami models show could be underwater within 20 minutes of a major earthquake. These communities often lack the resources for comprehensive emergency planning, and their seasonal populations of tourists and temporary workers complicate evacuation scenarios. The infrastructure supporting this massive population creates cascading vulnerabilities. Interstate 5, the primary north-south highway connecting all major Cascadian cities, crosses dozens of bridges and overpasses built before modern seismic standards. The highway carries 250,000 vehicles daily through Seattle alone, and its failure would paralyze regional transportation. Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, which handles 49 million passengers annually, sits on filled wetlands that could liquefy during major shaking. The Port of Seattle and Port of Vancouver, crucial for regional commerce, occupy waterfront areas vulnerable to both ground shaking and tsunamis. Emergency preparedness levels across the region remain alarmingly inadequate. Survey data shows that fewer than 40% of Cascadian residents maintain emergency supplies recommended by disaster experts. Most households lack the week's worth of food, water, and medical supplies that officials recommend for post-earthquake survival. Many residents don't know their neighborhood's tsunami evacuation routes, and some coastal communities have never conducted full-scale evacuation drills. The region's emergency management agencies, while professional and dedicated, face the impossible task of planning for the simultaneous evacuation of millions of people across multiple jurisdictions. Population density in urban cores means that building collapses could trap thousands of people simultaneously, overwhelming rescue capabilities. Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood houses 30,000 people per square mile, while Vancouver's West End reaches similar densities. Emergency responders would face impossible choices about where to focus limited resources when multiple catastrophes occur simultaneously across the region. Scientists have made a disturbing discovery about the timing of Cascadia's next major earthquake. The geological record shows that major ruptures occur roughly every 300 to 500 years, with the most recent happening in 1700. This means the current 325-year quiet period represents the longest gap between major earthquakes in the region's recorded history. The population boom that created today's 17 million residents occurred during this extended period of geological calm, meaning that no living person in Cascadia has experienced what this region can really do when the Earth decides to move. Yet despite these overwhelming risks, something remarkable has emerged from this concentration of people, wealth, and natural beauty. The very forces that draw millions to live in this geologically unstable region have also sparked dreams of something bigger than statehood or provincial status. The dream of Cascadian independence refuses to die, and in 2025, it's gaining momentum in ways that would have seemed impossible just a decade ago. Political parties advocating for bioregional sovereignty now appear on ballots across the Pacific Northwest, while polling data shows growing support for the idea that this region should govern itself rather than remain divided between two different nations. The movement represents something deeper than typical separatist politics. It's a vision of governance based on natural boundaries rather than colonial legacy borders. David McCloskey coined the term Cascadia in the 1970s and created the first comprehensive map of the bioregion, but the independence idea stretches back much further. Thomas Jefferson himself referred to Fort Astoria as the germ of a great, free, and independent empire in the early 1800s. John McLaughlin advocated for an independent Oregon country throughout the 19th century, recognizing that the Pacific Northwest's geographic isolation and distinct culture made it fundamentally different from eastern North America. These early visions planted seeds that continue growing today. The modern movement crystallized around cultural symbols that now permeate regional identity. The Doug flag, created in 1994 by Alexander Beretic, features blue representing the sky and Pacific Ocean, white for clouds and snow, and green for forests, with a Douglas fir tree symbolizing the region's resilience. This flag appears at soccer matches where Portland Timbers supporters display it alongside Seattle and Vancouver fans, creating a sense of shared identity that transcends national borders. The Cascadia Cup, awarded to the best Major League Soccer team in the Pacific Northwest, reinforces this cultural connection through friendly competition. Recent political developments show the movement evolving from cultural expression into serious political organizing. The Cascadia Party of British Columbia formed in 2016 and nominated candidates in the 2017 provincial election, advocating for sovereignty while promoting environmental protection and social justice. The Cascadia Bioregional Party, established in May 2021, expanded the political push into Washington and Oregon, calling for independence from both the United States and Canada, along with comprehensive social, environmental, and economic reforms. Their 2024 election results, while modest, demonstrated growing organizational capacity and voter recognition. The economic arguments for independence have never been stronger. With Cascadia's $1.5 trillion annual economic output, the region would rank among the world's largest economies if it achieved sovereignty. Independence advocates argue that the Pacific Northwest sends billions in tax revenue to Ottawa and Washington, D.C., while receiving proportionally less back in federal spending. They point to British Columbia's resource wealth, which supports equalization payments to other Canadian provinces. An independent Cascadia could theoretically retain these resources for regional development while maintaining trading relationships with both former parent countries. Environmental concerns drive much of the movement's philosophical foundation. Bioregionalism prioritizes ecological connections over political boundaries, arguing that watersheds and mountain ranges provide more logical governance units than arbitrary lines drawn by colonial powers. Climate change has intensified these arguments, with Cascadian activists claiming that their region's aggressive environmental policies conflict with federal governments that prioritize fossil fuel extraction and industrial agriculture. The region's commitment to renewable energy, sustainable forestry, and carbon reduction creates tension with national policies that environmental advocates consider inadequate. The movement gained renewed energy following recent federal policy disputes. Trade wars disrupted Pacific Northwest agricultural exports, while immigration restrictions complicated the region's tech industry recruitment. Cannabis legalization proceeded at different speeds across jurisdictions, creating regulatory complications for businesses operating across state and provincial lines. These policy conflicts reinforce arguments that Cascadia's interests align poorly with broader national priorities in both countries. Polling data reveals surprising support levels for various independence scenarios. A 2020 poll by Glacier Media and research company showed that support for British Columbia as a standalone independent country had risen to 27% from 17% in 2018 and 2019. Support for joining with Washington and Oregon reached even higher levels, with 66% of those aged 18 to 34 supporting some form of bioregional confederation. A 2005 Western Standard poll found that 35.6% of Western Canadians agreed that Western provinces should explore forming their own country, suggesting broader regional dissatisfaction with federal governance. The Cascadia Department of Bioregion now actively works to make independence a reality, while building networks with bioregional movements worldwide. Their 2025 activities include organizing cross-border conferences, developing economic models for independence, and creating educational materials about bioregional governance. They've established sister relationships with similar movements in Catalonia, Scotland, and other regions seeking greater autonomy based on cultural and geographic identity rather than existing political structures. Yet the practical impossibilities of Cascadian independence remain overwhelming. Secession from one country presents enormous legal and political challenges. Seceding from two countries simultaneously appears virtually impossible under current international law. The United States has no constitutional mechanism for peaceful secession, while Canada's Supreme Court has established strict criteria for provincial independence that would be difficult to meet. Neither country would willingly surrender economically valuable territory, particularly regions that contribute disproportionately to federal revenues. Independence advocates rarely address their region's greatest vulnerability when promoting sovereignty. The geological time bomb beneath Cascadia poses existential questions about any future nation's viability. How would an independent government handle the massive reconstruction costs following a major earthquake? What about international aid coordination, refugee resettlement, and economic recovery when traditional federal support systems no longer exist? The region's concentrated population and infrastructure would face catastrophic damage without the broader resources that come from being part of larger nations. The ultimate irony of Cascadian independence is that success would create a nation uniquely vulnerable to natural disaster. The same geological forces that shaped the region's natural beauty and abundant resources also guarantee future catastrophe. Any independent Cascadia would inherit not just the world's most livable bioregion, but also one of its most dangerous geological situations. The movement's beautiful dream of sovereignty would come with a terrible geological inheritance that no amount of political independence could escape. And that inheritance lies hidden in the darkness beneath the Pacific Ocean, where forces beyond human control continue building toward an inevitable reckoning. The fault line that could end everything. This underwater threat represents one of the most dangerous geological features on Earth. The Cascadia subduction zone stretches 600 miles from Vancouver Island all the way down to Northern California, capable of generating earthquakes so powerful they could reshape coastlines and send tsunamis racing across the ocean at the speed of a commercial jet. The mechanics of this geological threat are both fascinating and terrifying. The Juan de Fuca plate, a massive slab of oceanic crust, slides beneath the North American plate at 40 millimeters per year in a process called subduction. Picture two enormous conveyor belts moving in opposite directions, except these belts are made of solid rock, and each one spans hundreds of miles. The Juan de Fuca plate moves eastward, diving beneath the lighter continental plate that supports the cities and towns of the Pacific Northwest. This process creates what scientists call a subduction zone, and these geological features rank among the most dangerous on the planet. Unlike the San Andreas Fault in California, which involves two plates sliding past each other horizontally, subduction zones involve one plate diving beneath another. This creates entirely different mechanics that can generate far more powerful earthquakes. The San Andreas system can produce earthquakes up to magnitude 8.0, but subduction zones routinely generate magnitude 9.0 earthquakes that release over 30 times more energy. The Cascadia subduction zone possesses unique characteristics that make it particularly threatening compared to other fault systems worldwide. Most subduction zones around the Pacific Ring of Fire produce frequent smaller earthquakes that release pressure gradually. But Cascadia behaves differently. It stays locked for centuries, building enormous pressure before releasing everything at once in a catastrophic megathrust earthquake capable of reaching magnitude 9.0. This fault system extends across the entire Pacific Northwest coastline, threatening every major population center simultaneously. The northern end begins near Vancouver Island, where the fault lies just 50 miles offshore from Victoria. The zone continues southward past Seattle, where it sits roughly 100 miles offshore in the Pacific Ocean. Near Portland, the fault runs approximately 150 miles offshore, while its southern terminus lies about 200 miles off the California coast near Cape Mendocino. This vast extent means that a single earthquake could affect the entire region simultaneously, from British Columbia to Northern California. The concept of a locked fault creates the conditions for catastrophic failure. Along most of the Cascadia subduction zone, the two plates have become stuck together due to friction and pressure. The Juan de Fuca plate continues pushing eastward, but instead of sliding smoothly beneath the North American plate, it drags the overlying plate downward and westward. This creates a bow-like deformation along the Pacific Northwest coast, with some areas sinking several millimeters per year while others rise. Scientists can measure this deformation using GPS stations and satellite monitoring, revealing that the North American plate is being compressed like a giant spring. Coastal areas from Vancouver Island to Northern California are slowly tilting westward as the locked fault system builds pressure. This process has continued for over 320 years since the last major earthquake, creating an enormous amount of stored energy that will eventually be released in a single catastrophic event. Recent scientific discoveries have revealed disturbing details about the fault's current state and behavior. Researchers using underwater robots and seismic monitoring equipment have mapped the fault system in unprecedented detail. They've discovered that the locked zone extends much deeper than previously thought, reaching depths of 25 miles below the seafloor. This deeper locking creates the potential for even more powerful earthquakes than earlier estimates suggested. New research from the University of Washington has provided insights into tsunami generation along the Cascadia subduction zone. Scientists searched for megasplay faults, which are secondary fault systems that can amplify tsunami waves. While these faults exist in many subduction zones worldwide, the Cascadia system appears to lack continuous megasplay faults along its entire length. This discovery suggests that tsunami waves may not be quite as large or fast arriving in some coastal areas, though the threat remains enormous. Underwater sediment cores taken from the continental shelf reveal the fault's historical behavior over thousands of years. These cores show layers of sand and debris that were deposited by ancient tsunamis, creating a timeline of past earthquakes. The pattern shows that major earthquakes occur roughly every 300 to 500 years, with some clusters of events happening closer together. The most recent major earthquake occurred in 1700, meaning the current quiet period has lasted longer than average. Advanced computer modeling now allows scientists to simulate exactly what happens when the Cascadia subduction zone ruptures. These models show that the locked fault can slip up to 60 feet in a matter of minutes, causing the seafloor to suddenly rise by 6 to 10 feet across thousands of square miles. This massive displacement of water creates tsunami waves that radiate outward in all directions, carrying the energy of the earthquake across the Pacific Ocean. The geological pressure cooker continues building energy with each passing day. Strain measurements show that the North American plate is currently being compressed at a rate that adds equivalent energy to a magnitude 6.5 earthquake every decade. This means that over 3 centuries since the last major earthquake, the fault system has accumulated energy equivalent to hundreds of smaller earthquakes. When this stored energy finally releases, it will create one of the most powerful earthquakes in recorded history. Scientists now possess sophisticated tools to understand the devastating potential of the next rupture. Advanced seismic monitoring networks can detect the smallest movements along the fault system, while computer models simulate earthquake scenarios with increasing accuracy. Tsunami propagation models show wave heights and arrival times for coastlines across the Pacific Ocean. These tools reveal that the next Cascadia earthquake won't just affect the Pacific Northwest. It will be felt from Alaska to California and send deadly waves to Japan, Hawaii, and other Pacific nations. The fault system's behavior patterns suggest that the next major earthquake could happen at any time. While scientists cannot predict exactly when it will occur, they know that each year of continued quiet increases the probability of catastrophic failure. The last time this geological monster awakened, it left clues that scientists are only now beginning to understand, scattered across 2 continents and preserved in the most unexpected places. When the Earth last spoke in 1700, on the evening of January 26, 1700, something extraordinary happened that would connect 2 continents in a shared natural disaster. Massive waves suddenly crashed ashore along the coast of Japan with no warning, flooding rice paddies and destroying coastal villages. Japanese officials meticulously recorded the event in their historical chronicles, noting the unusual nature of these waves that appeared without any local earthquake to explain their origin. They called it an orphan tsunami because no parent earthquake could be found anywhere near Japan. The answer lay hidden on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, preserved in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples who had lived along the Pacific Northwest coast for thousands of years. Indigenous oral histories from multiple tribes described violent shaking and great waves, later matched to Japanese tsunami records by scientists. The Makah people of the Olympic Peninsula told of a battle between thunderbird and whale that caused the earth to tremble and the sea to rise. The Yurok tribe in Northern California described how the ground shook so hard that people couldn't stand, followed by waves that reached far inland. These stories, passed down through generations, contained precise details about timing, duration, and effects that would prove crucial to understanding what really happened. European explorers wouldn't arrive in the Pacific Northwest for another 92 years after the 1700 earthquake, meaning no written records existed from the affected region. The indigenous accounts became the only human testimony of the event, and they painted a picture of catastrophic destruction. Tribal elders described how the shaking lasted long enough for people to run from their homes, gather belongings, and flee to higher ground. The Quileute people spoke of how the ocean receded far from shore before returning as a wall of water. These oral histories provided scientists with timing information, duration estimates, and geographic extent that no other source could offer. Modern scientists began connecting these separate pieces of evidence in the 1980s and 1990s, using techniques that didn't exist when the earthquake occurred. Tree ring dating of ghost forests pinned the quake to January 26, 1700, while sediment cores from coastal marshes showed layers of sand deposited by tsunamis. Geological surveys found evidence of massive landslides and ground failure throughout the Pacific Northwest, all dating to the same time period. These multiple lines of evidence allowed researchers to reconstruct the January 26, 1700 earthquake in remarkable detail. The earthquake began at approximately 9 p.m. local time and continued shaking for 5 full minutes. This duration far exceeded typical earthquakes, indicating a rupture of extraordinary length and power. The fault break extended along the entire 600-mile length of the Cascadia subduction zone, from Vancouver Island to Northern California. The seafloor suddenly rose 6 to 10 feet across thousands of square miles, displacing massive volumes of water and creating the tsunami that would travel across the Pacific Ocean. Coastal areas throughout the Pacific Northwest dropped 3 to 6 feet in elevation as the North American plate snapped back after centuries of being dragged down by the subducting Juan de Fuca plate. The tsunami generated by this seafloor displacement raced across the Pacific at speeds reaching 500 miles per hour. Wave heights near the Pacific Northwest coast reached 30 to 100 feet in some areas, penetrating up to 2 miles inland and destroying everything in their path. The waves followed the curvature of the Pacific Basin, traveling northwest toward Japan, while also spreading south toward California and north toward Alaska. As the tsunami crossed the deep ocean, it maintained its speed while spreading its energy across an increasingly wide front. 10 hours after the earthquake struck the Pacific Northwest, the tsunami reached the shores of Japan. The waves arrived during the evening hours, matching exactly with Japanese historical records that described the mysterious flooding. Japanese documents from the time recorded wave heights of 6 to 10 feet along portions of the Honshu coast, with some areas experiencing more severe flooding. The waves penetrated rice paddies and damaged coastal structures, but the reduced height after crossing the Pacific meant the impact was far less severe than what the Pacific Northwest experienced. The connection between the Pacific Northwest earthquake and the Japanese tsunami wasn't established until the 1990s, when researchers began comparing the timing and characteristics of both events. Japanese historical records provided precise dates and times that matched perfectly with the geological evidence from North America. This discovery represented a breakthrough in understanding how Cascadia earthquakes affect the entire Pacific Rim, demonstrating that the region's seismic events create truly trans-Pacific disasters. Geological evidence from the 1700 earthquake reveals the massive scale of environmental change that occurred. Ghost forests along the Pacific Northwest coast show where towering cedars and spruces died instantly when the land suddenly subsided. These preserved tree stumps, still visible today at places like Nehalem Bay in Oregon, provide haunting testimony to the earthquake's power. The trees died when saltwater flooded their root systems after the land dropped, creating eerie landscapes of bleached wooden monuments to geological catastrophe. The 1700 earthquake represents the most recent major rupture of the Cascadia subduction zone, but geological evidence shows similar events occurred regularly throughout prehistory. Scientists have identified at least 19 major earthquakes over the past 10,000 years, with intervals between events ranging from 200 to 800 years. The average interval between major earthquakes is approximately 530 years, though clustering patterns show that some periods experienced multiple large earthquakes within shorter time frames. This historical precedent provides crucial insights into what the next major Cascadia earthquake might produce. The 1700 event generated a magnitude 9.0 earthquake, among the most powerful in recorded history. The tsunami it created affected coastlines across the Pacific Ocean, demonstrating that future Cascadia earthquakes will impact far more than just the Pacific Northwest. The geological processes that caused the 1700 earthquake continue operating today, building pressure that will eventually be released in another catastrophic event. With 325 years having passed since that devastating night, scientists have developed increasingly sophisticated methods to calculate exactly when the next rupture might occur, and their findings reveal probabilities that should concern everyone living in the region. Destruction. The mathematical calculations behind these predictions reveal probabilities that demand immediate attention. Scientists estimate a 37% probability that a major earthquake of magnitude 7.1 or greater will strike the Cascadia subduction zone within the next 50 years, while the probability of a magnitude 9.0 earthquake specifically reaches approximately 12% over the same time frame. These figures represent the lower end of the threat spectrum because the real monster lurking beneath the Pacific Northwest could generate earthquakes ranging from magnitude 8.0 to 9.2 on the Richter scale. Magnitude 9.0 earthquakes release energy equivalent to billions of tons of TNT, creating destruction on a scale that defies comprehension. The current scientific consensus points to an increasingly urgent timeline for the next major earthquake. The Cascadia subduction zone has remained quiet for 325 years since the 1700 event, but geological evidence shows that major earthquakes typically occur every 300 to 500 years along this fault system. The average interval between major ruptures is approximately 530 years, which means the current quiet period has already exceeded the lower end of the typical range. Each additional year of silence increases the probability that the fault system has accumulated enough energy to produce a catastrophic release. Breaking down the probability calculations reveals just how significant these percentages really mean in practical terms. A 37% chance translates to roughly a 1 in 3 probability that anyone living in Cascadia today will experience a major earthquake during their lifetime. For comparison, the probability of being struck by lightning in any given year is about 1 in 500,000, while the probability of winning most state lotteries is around 1 in 14 million. The earthquake probability represents a risk thousands of times higher than these everyday comparisons, yet most residents treat it as a distant possibility rather than a pressing concern. The potential magnitude range from 8.0 to 9.2 encompasses levels of destruction that most people cannot comprehend. A magnitude 8.0 earthquake would cause severe damage across the entire Pacific Northwest, collapsing unreinforced buildings and causing widespread infrastructure failure. A magnitude 8.5 earthquake would multiply this destruction significantly, potentially triggering major landslides and causing liquefaction across broad areas of soft soil. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake, matching the 1700 event, would create catastrophic damage throughout the region, with shaking intense enough to make standing impossible and lasting long enough to cause total structural failure of buildings not designed for such forces. The upper end of the magnitude range presents scenarios that exceed historical precedent. A magnitude 9.2 earthquake would rank among the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded, comparable to the 1964 Alaska earthquake or the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake that created the devastating tsunami. This level of energy release would cause the seafloor to rise 10 to 15 feet across thousands of square miles, displacing massive volumes of water and creating tsunami waves higher than any in recorded Pacific Northwest history. The duration of shaking during a major Cascadia earthquake will far exceed what most people expect from earthquake experience. Shaking lasting up to 6 minutes, 10 times longer than most earthquakes, would overwhelm building designs throughout the region. This prolonged shaking creates cumulative damage that overwhelms building structures designed for shorter duration events. Modern buildings in the Pacific Northwest meet seismic codes based on California earthquake data, but these codes don't account for the extended shaking duration that characterizes subduction zone earthquakes. The tsunami generation process begins the moment the seafloor ruptures and rises. Computer models show that the initial displacement will create waves reaching 100 feet in height near the Pacific Northwest coast, with some areas experiencing waves up to 130 feet tall. These waves will travel inland at speeds of 25 to 35 miles per hour, carrying enormous amounts of debris and maintaining destructive power for distances up to 3 miles from the shoreline. Coastal areas will experience wave arrival times ranging from 15 to 30 minutes after the earthquake, providing minimal time for evacuation. Wave height projections vary significantly across different coastal areas based on underwater topography and shoreline geometry. The Oregon coast faces the highest tsunami risk, with models showing wave heights of 80 to 100 feet in many areas. Washington's outer coast will experience similar wave heights, while Puget Sound areas will see smaller but still dangerous waves ranging from 10 to 20 feet. The Strait of Juan de Fuca will funnel tsunami energy toward populated areas around Victoria and Port Angeles, creating wave heights of 15 to 25 feet. Northern California's coast will experience waves of 60 to 80 feet, particularly in areas like Humboldt Bay and Crescent City. The 2025 population density throughout Cascadia multiplies the potential casualty figures far beyond what the 1700 earthquake would have caused. Current estimates suggest that a magnitude 9.0 earthquake could kill between 13,000 and 27,000 people in the Pacific Northwest alone, with a wide range reflecting different scenarios for building performance and emergency response effectiveness. The death toll could exceed 50,000 if the earthquake occurs during peak tourist season, when coastal populations swell with visitors unfamiliar with evacuation procedures. Economic losses from a major Cascadia earthquake would dwarf previous natural disasters in North American history. Initial estimates suggest total economic impacts ranging from $70 billion to $200 billion, but these figures may underestimate the true costs. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan caused over $200 billion in damages, and Cascadia's concentrated economic activity could produce similar or higher losses. Insurance industry analyses suggest that total economic impacts could approach $300 billion when accounting for business interruption, supply chain disruptions, and long-term reconstruction costs. The cascading effects extend far beyond the immediate earthquake and tsunami damage. The collapse of Interstate 5 would sever the primary transportation link between Canada and California, disrupting commerce across the entire western United States. The failure of major ports in Seattle, Vancouver, and Portland would interrupt trade flows worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually. The region's electrical grid would face widespread failure, potentially leaving millions without power for weeks or months. Natural gas pipelines crossing the region could rupture, creating fire hazards and cutting off energy supplies to California and other western states. Yet these catastrophic projections only account for the destruction within the Pacific Northwest itself. The tsunami generated by this geological catastrophe will carry its destructive power far beyond North American shores, creating a disaster that spans an entire ocean. The tsunami that will cross an ocean. When the Cascadia subduction zone finally ruptures, the resulting tsunami won't politely stop at the Pacific Northwest coastline. This massive wave will race across the Pacific Ocean at speeds reaching 500 miles per hour, carrying the earthquake's destructive energy to every nation that borders the Pacific Rim. The wave will strike Hawaii in approximately 4.5 hours, reach Japan in about 10 hours, and affect coastlines from Alaska to Chile before the disaster is complete. Wave propagation models developed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration show the tsunami spreading across the Pacific like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. Except these ripples carry the energy of a magnitude 9.0 earthquake. The waves will maintain their speed across the deep ocean, slowing only when they encounter shallow coastal waters where their energy compresses into towering walls of water. Computer simulations based on the 1700 earthquake show the tsunami reaching Hawaii with wave heights ranging from 3 to 15 feet, depending on specific coastal geography and underwater topography. Japan faces a particularly complex threat from Cascadia-generated tsunamis due to its position across the Pacific and its extensive coastal development. The 1700 Cascadia earthquake sent waves that reached Japan's shores at heights of 6 to 10 feet, flooding rice paddies and coastal communities. Modern population densities along Japan's coast mean that similar wave heights today would affect millions of people living in areas that were largely rural 3 centuries ago. Tokyo Bay, Osaka Bay, and other major population centers could experience significant flooding from waves that seem modest compared to what the Pacific Northwest will endure. The unique characteristics of Cascadia-generated tsunamis create threats that differ significantly from other Pacific tsunami sources. Most Pacific tsunamis originate from earthquakes near populated areas, providing some advance warning through ground shaking. But Cascadia tsunamis will strike distant shores with no local earthquake to alert residents. The waves will arrive during normal daily activities, catching populations completely off guard. The duration of the tsunami will also exceed typical events, with dangerous waves continuing for 12 to 24 hours as the energy disperses across the Pacific Basin. Low-lying islands would face existential threats as waves up to 15 feet inundate entire nations. The Marshall Islands, with a maximum elevation of 30 feet above sea level, could experience complete inundation from these waves. Tuvalu, Kiribati, and other low-lying island nations would face similar devastation, potentially rendering entire countries uninhabitable for extended periods. These nations lack the economic resources to construct extensive tsunami defenses, making them completely vulnerable to wave heights that would be manageable for more developed coastal areas. Hawaii's position in the Central Pacific places it directly in the path of Cascadia tsunami energy. The island chain experienced significant damage from the 1946 Alaska tsunami and the 1960 Chilean tsunami, demonstrating its vulnerability to Pacific-wide events. Honolulu's Waikiki Beach, home to thousands of tourists on any given day, sits at elevations that would be completely underwater during a major Cascadia tsunami. The island's economy depends heavily on tourism, and a major tsunami would devastate this industry for years while coastal infrastructure undergoes reconstruction. International tsunami warning networks exist, but often lack sufficient coverage to alert distant coasts in time. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Hawaii monitors seismic activity across the Pacific and can issue warnings within 15 minutes of a major earthquake. However, the system relies on coastal nations to maintain their own detection networks and communication systems. Many Pacific Rim countries lack the infrastructure to receive and disseminate warnings effectively, particularly to rural coastal communities that would be most affected by tsunami waves. Global shipping and trade routes face massive disruption from a Cascadia tsunami that extends far beyond the initial wave impacts. Major ports in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego would close immediately upon receiving tsunami warnings, halting billions of dollars in daily trade. Asian ports would implement similar closures, creating a domino effect that shuts down Pacific shipping for days or weeks. Container ships at sea would face dangerous conditions as tsunami waves pass beneath them, while vessels in port could be damaged or destroyed by the waves. The disruption extends to submarine communication cables that carry internet traffic across the Pacific. These cables, which handle the majority of internet communication between Asia and North America, are vulnerable to damage from underwater landslides and strong currents generated by the tsunami. The failure of these communication links would severely impact global financial markets and international commerce, potentially triggering a communications crisis that compounds the natural disaster. Economic ripple effects across Pacific Rim economies would begin within hours of the earthquake and continue for months or years. Tokyo's stock market would likely suspend trading due to tsunami warnings, while financial markets in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Sydney would experience panic selling as investors react to the unfolding disaster. The integrated nature of modern supply chains means that factory closures in affected areas would quickly impact production worldwide, creating shortages of electronic components, automobiles, and consumer goods. The tourism industry across the Pacific would face immediate collapse as travelers cancel plans and governments issue travel advisories. Hawaii's economy, which depends on tourism for 25% of its gross domestic product, would face economic devastation even if the islands experience only moderate tsunami damage. Pacific cruise lines would cancel operations for weeks while ports assess damage and rebuild facilities. The airline industry would face massive disruption as Pacific routes are altered to avoid affected airports and airspace. Agricultural exports from Pacific Rim countries would face severe disruption as ports close and transportation networks fail. Australia's wheat exports, Chile's fruit exports, and California's agricultural products would accumulate in warehouses and storage facilities, unable to reach international markets. The failure of food distribution systems would create localized shortages and price spikes, affecting populations far from the tsunami impact zone. The interconnected nature of the global economy means that a single geological event beneath the Pacific Northwest could trigger the most expensive natural disaster in human history. The combination of direct damage, business interruption, and supply chain disruption would create economic losses measured in trillions of dollars rather than billions. Financial markets worldwide would face a crisis of confidence as investors realize that modern civilization's most productive regions remain vulnerable to ancient geological forces that recognize no political boundaries or economic systems. Yet for all the sophisticated modeling and international coordination systems designed to track this trans-Pacific threat, the most vulnerable populations remain those closest to the source. The millions of people living directly above the Cascadia subduction zone face a disturbing reality that most have never seriously considered: the unprepared millions. Here's the devastating reality that keeps seismologists awake at night. Despite knowing exactly what's coming and roughly when it will arrive, the vast majority of Cascadia's residents remain catastrophically unprepared for the next major earthquake. Survey data from 2024 shows that fewer than 40% of Pacific Northwest households maintain the basic emergency supplies that disaster experts recommend. Most families lack even a 3-day supply of food and water, let alone the 2-week minimum that officials now recommend for post-earthquake survival in isolated areas. Most households in Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver lack recommended emergency supplies or evacuation plans. Emergency management officials estimate that the majority of residents would be unable to survive independently for more than 72 hours following a major earthquake. This widespread unpreparedness extends beyond individual households to encompass entire communities that have never seriously confronted the scale of destruction they will face. The challenge of evacuating millions of people from tsunami zones represents a logistical nightmare that has no precedent in modern disaster planning. Coastal areas from Northern California to Vancouver Island would need to evacuate approximately 500,000 people within 15 to 30 minutes of earthquake occurrence. This evacuation must happen while roads buckle, bridges collapse, and traffic signals fail. Most coastal communities have identified evacuation routes that lead to higher ground, but these routes assume normal traffic conditions and functioning infrastructure. The reality is that damaged roads and panic drivers will create traffic jams that trap people in exactly the areas where tsunami waves will strike. Current building codes throughout the Pacific Northwest remain inadequate for the type of prolonged, intense shaking that characterizes subduction zone earthquakes. Most structures built before 1990 lack proper seismic reinforcement, and even newer buildings may not withstand the 4 to 6 minutes of violent shaking that a magnitude 9.0 earthquake will produce. Unreinforced masonry buildings, common in downtown cores from Portland to Vancouver, will collapse almost immediately. The Oregon Department of Emergency Management estimates that 75% of buildings in the coastal zone will be uninhabitable following a major earthquake, leaving survivors without shelter during the critical first weeks of recovery. Retrofit programs designed to strengthen existing buildings have proceeded at a glacial pace across the region. The cost of comprehensive seismic retrofitting ranges from $15 to $30 per square foot, making it prohibitively expensive for many property owners. Without significant government incentives or mandates, most buildings will remain vulnerable when the next major earthquake strikes. The slow progress of these programs means that thousands of structures that could be strengthened remain death traps waiting for the earth to move. Psychological factors play a crucial role in preventing people from taking the earthquake threat seriously. The 325-year gap since the last major earthquake means that no living person has experienced what Cascadia can actually do. This creates a psychological distance that makes the threat feel abstract and manageable. People who have lived through California earthquakes often dismiss Cascadia's threat because they survived magnitude 6.0 or 7.0 earthquakes without major difficulty. They fail to understand that a magnitude 9.0 earthquake releases over 1,000 times more energy and will continue shaking for minutes rather than seconds. The economic costs of proper preparation pale in comparison to the costs of being unprepared. Installing basic emergency supplies costs individual households approximately $500 to $1,000 per family. Comprehensive seismic retrofitting for a typical home ranges from $3,000 to $15,000. Regional infrastructure improvements would cost an estimated $75 billion over 20 years. These figures seem enormous until compared to the projected $200 billion in damages from the next major earthquake. The Oregon Department of Emergency Management anticipates that the region could be without essential services and assistance for at least 2 weeks, if not longer, following a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. Japan provides a compelling example of successful earthquake preparedness that demonstrates what comprehensive planning can achieve. Following the 1995 Kobe earthquake, Japan invested over $100 billion in seismic retrofitting and early warning systems. The country's building codes now require structures to withstand prolonged shaking, while automated systems shut down trains and factories when earthquake waves are detected. Public education campaigns ensure that most residents understand evacuation procedures and maintain emergency supplies. When the 2011 Tohoku earthquake struck, Japan's preparedness measures prevented catastrophic casualties despite the disaster's enormous magnitude. New Zealand implemented similar comprehensive earthquake preparedness following the 2010 and 2011 Canterbury earthquakes. The country strengthened building codes, created detailed evacuation plans, and established public education programs that significantly improved earthquake readiness. Chile's experience with the 2010 earthquake led to improved tsunami warning systems and evacuation procedures that saved thousands of lives during subsequent events. These examples demonstrate that effective preparation is possible, but requires sustained political commitment and significant financial investment. Climate change and other immediate threats consistently overshadow long-term seismic risks in public consciousness and government planning. Rising sea levels, wildfire threats, and extreme weather events dominate environmental discussions because they produce visible, ongoing impacts. The earthquake threat, while far more catastrophic in potential scope, remains invisible and abstract to most people. Politicians find it easier to fund visible improvements like flood barriers and fire prevention than earthquake retrofits that may not be needed for decades. This misallocation of attention and resources leaves the region vulnerable to its greatest natural hazard. The compounding effects of climate change will make earthquake recovery far more difficult than historical precedents suggest. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that a major earthquake could cause coastal land to sink up to 6.5 feet, expanding the 1% coastal floodplain and potentially tripling the number of people, buildings, and roads exposed to flooding. Rising sea levels will make this subsidence effect permanent, creating new flood zones that will complicate reconstruction efforts. The study shows that a Cascadia earthquake could more than triple current flood exposure by 2100, affecting a dramatically larger swath of infrastructure and population. When disaster strikes an unprepared population, the results are predictably catastrophic. The 2010 Haiti earthquake killed over 200,000 people largely because the population lacked earthquake-resistant buildings and emergency preparedness. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami killed 230,000 people across multiple countries because early warning systems didn't exist and coastal populations didn't recognize natural warning signs. Cascadia's concentrated population and inadequate preparation create conditions for a similar humanitarian catastrophe, but on a scale that could affect millions rather than thousands. The window for effective preparation is rapidly closing with each passing year. The Cascadia subduction zone continues building pressure that will eventually be released in a catastrophic earthquake. Every year of delay means more vulnerable buildings, more unprepared residents, and more concentrated infrastructure in harm's way. Time itself has become the most critical factor in determining whether this region will face its geological destiny as a prepared society or as millions of unsuspecting victims. Scientists and emergency planners across the Pacific Northwest are engaged in a desperate race against forces they cannot control or predict. Every single day that passes brings Cascadia one step closer to its inevitable geological reckoning. The Juan de Fuca Plate continues its relentless eastward march beneath the North American plate, with roughly 40 mm per year of plate convergence building stress in a fault system that has remained locked for 325 years. Scientists use GPS and hundreds of seismometers to track deformation, but still can't predict timing. The only certainty is that each sunrise brings the region closer to one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in human history. Advanced technological developments in earthquake prediction and early warning have made significant progress, though major limitations remain. The Shake Alert system, operational since 2019, can detect the initial earthquake waves and send warnings to mobile phones within seconds of a major earthquake's onset. This system successfully provided warnings for recent California earthquakes, giving people crucial seconds to take protective action. However, the system cannot predict when earthquakes will occur, only detect them after they begin. For Cascadia earthquakes, this means coastal residents might receive 15 to 30 seconds of warning before the most intense shaking arrives. The massive infrastructure projects needed to improve regional resilience would require unprecedented coordination and funding across multiple jurisdictions. The Oregon Department of Transportation estimates that seismic retrofitting of bridges and overpasses throughout the state would cost $15 billion over 20 years. Washington state faces similar costs for upgrading its transportation infrastructure, while British Columbia would need comparable investments. These projects must happen while maintaining normal traffic flow and commerce, creating logistical challenges that multiply the costs and complexity. Building retrofit programs represent another enormous infrastructure challenge. Seattle's mandatory seismic upgrade program requires owners of unreinforced masonry buildings to strengthen their structures, but the program has proceeded slowly due to high costs and complex regulations. Property owners face retrofit costs ranging from $15 to $30 per square foot, making comprehensive upgrades prohibitively expensive for many buildings. Portland's similar program has upgraded fewer than 300 buildings since its inception, leaving thousands of vulnerable structures throughout the city. Federal funding for earthquake preparedness remains limited compared to the scale of the challenge. The Federal Emergency Management Agency provides grants for seismic retrofitting, but these programs cover only a fraction of the total costs. The Earthquake Hazards Reduction Act authorizes research and monitoring programs, but does not provide comprehensive funding for infrastructure improvements. State and local governments must shoulder most of the financial burden for earthquake preparedness, creating uneven progress across different jurisdictions. Several communities have demonstrated that significant seismic readiness improvements are possible with sustained effort and resources. The city of Berkeley, California, implemented one of the most comprehensive seismic retrofit programs in the United States, requiring upgrades to all soft-story buildings and unreinforced masonry structures. The program included financial incentives and technical assistance that helped property owners complete necessary improvements. Similar programs in Los Angeles and San Francisco have strengthened thousands of buildings while creating jobs and improving neighborhood safety. Japan's comprehensive earthquake preparedness provides a model for what large-scale resilience planning can achieve. Following the 1995 Kobe earthquake, Japan invested over $100 billion in seismic retrofitting, early warning systems, and emergency preparedness. The country's building codes now require structures to withstand prolonged shaking from major earthquakes. Public education campaigns ensure that most residents understand evacuation procedures and maintain emergency supplies. When the 2011 Tohoku earthquake struck, Japan's preparedness measures prevented catastrophic casualties despite the disaster's enormous magnitude. Individual preparedness efforts provide crucial complement to government response capabilities. Households that maintain emergency supplies and develop family emergency plans can survive independently for weeks following major earthquakes. These preparations reduce demand on emergency services and allow professional responders to focus on life-threatening situations. However, individual preparedness cannot substitute for comprehensive infrastructure improvements and government planning. The scale of a major Cascadia earthquake will overwhelm individual preparations unless supported by resilient infrastructure and effective emergency response systems. The region's continued population growth complicates disaster planning in fundamental ways. Every new resident represents another person who needs evacuation routes, emergency shelter, and post-disaster services. New construction adds to the infrastructure that must be protected or replaced following major earthquakes. Urban densification, while environmentally beneficial, concentrates more people in areas vulnerable to building collapse and infrastructure failure. The rapid pace of development often outstrips the ability of emergency planners to update evacuation routes and emergency procedures. Housing costs throughout the region have pushed many residents to more vulnerable areas where earthquake risks are higher. Coastal communities that were once sparsely populated now house thousands of people in tsunami inundation zones. Areas built on filled wetlands or loose sediments, where housing costs are lower, have attracted residents who may not understand their geological vulnerability. This demographic shift places more people at risk while complicating emergency response planning. The race against geological time reveals the fundamental challenge facing Cascadia. Scientists can measure the accumulating stress, engineers can design stronger buildings, and emergency planners can develop evacuation procedures, but none of these efforts can prevent the earthquake itself. The Juan de Fuca plate will continue its inexorable movement eastward, building pressure until the locked fault system reaches its breaking point. Every improvement in preparedness represents progress, but every day of delay means more people and infrastructure in harm's way when the inevitable finally occurs. This creates a profound tension between the region's extraordinary appeal and its geological reality. The same forces that make Cascadia one of the world's most desirable places to live also guarantee its eventual devastation. The question becomes whether human ingenuity and determination can outpace the geological clock that has been ticking for over 3 centuries. The challenge facing Cascadia extends beyond earthquake timing to encompass 3 critical pillars: affordable housing, resilient infrastructure, and seismic preparedness. The same tectonic forces that created its temperate rainforests, volcanic peaks, and abundant resources also guarantee its eventual destruction. The question isn't whether the next major earthquake will occur, but when, and whether over 17 million people will be ready. This regional threat carries global implications, affecting Pacific Rim nations and international commerce. The window for effective preparation remains critical as geological pressure increases annually beneath one of the world's most economically productive regions. Take action now by creating your own emergency preparedness plan and sharing earthquake safety resources with your community. The geological clock continues ticking, but human preparation can still make the difference between catastrophe and survival.